Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel NSR Info Technologies. So in today's session I'll be discussing with you the differences between SparkContext and SparkSession. So remember guys, this is one of the most important interview questions also. Okay, alright, so coming to the first concept, which is SparkContext. So when do we use SparkContext and SparkSession? So what is the limitations, what are its different kinds of definitions, properties, how do we create it, its limitations, those all things we'll be discussing now. Alright, so coming to its definition, so what is the definition of SparkContext? Basically what a SparkContext is. So SparkContext, right, in the earlier versions like 1.x and even before 2.x, SparkContext used to be the entry point for any particular Spark based application. Okay, so for any particular Spark based application, Spark context used to be the entry point. So coming to the later versions of Spark, right, 2.x or after 2.x, so SparkSession is the one which is serving as an entry point. Okay, for any particular Spark based applications or Spark based functionalities, SparkSession is the entry point. So here, right, for a particular Spark context, when we are dealing with 1.x or so, right, we used to have three different entry points. So what were they? Spark context, Spark context, SQL context, and Hive context. So these three were the different entry points which were dealing with Spark context. Okay, so once our Spark 2.x SparkSession has been introduced, right, like after Spark 2.x, a new entry point was created. Okay, so a new entry point was created, and that entry point is called as SparkSession. So basically inside this SparkSession, what do we have? So you can actually assume it as a unified API wherein you will be having access to all the APIs like Spark context, streaming context, SQL context, and Hive context. Okay, unlike this particular Spark context, you don't have to create each and everything individually. Here if you just use this SparkSession, since it is a unified API, everything is present inside the same API. So it's just that you will have to create this one and you can access all these particular APIs. Okay, so now let us see, this particular thing is there right here, RDDs accumulators. So previously for Spark context, right, what is the entry point? It is the entry point to Spark programming, but here we used to deal with RDDs. Okay, so your Spark context is nothing but it is an entry point to your Spark programming with related to RDDs, and if you want to connect to the particular Spark cluster, we used to use our Spark context. Okay, so coming to SparkSession, right, here what happened when you want to deal with data frames or data sets, right, so this used to serve as an entry point to start programming. Okay, so that is the major difference between Spark context and SparkSession. Alright, so not only that, so if you want to work with any kind of RDDs, accumulators, and broadcast variables on the cluster, right, Spark context used to represent a Spark clusters connection. Okay, so basically using these particular things, right, your Spark context will represent Spark clusters connection, and wherein we can make use of in building these RDDs, accumulators, broadcast variables on that particular cluster. Okay, all right, so one more thing, we have its creation and also its object, right. So coming to its object first, so here, right, for any particular Spark based application, we used to Spark context, right, we used to have something called as a default object. Okay, so we have something called as a default object which is called as a Spark context. So that Spark context, we can just consider the default object as SC. Okay, SC is the Spark context default object which is provided in our Spark shell, and it can be programmatically created using Spark context class as well. Okay, all right, so here, right, basically using this Spark context, what all Spark functions are provided. So the examples of the Spark context, the functionalities which are provided by your Spark context are like, you can get to know the current status of your Spark application. Also you can set the configurations, also you can cancel a particular task, cancel a stage, and much more. Okay, so those are the different kinds of functions which you can use when you are working with your Spark context. Alright, so what is the default object here? SC is nothing but Spark context. Coming to Spark session, so in our Spark session, right, so what is the default object here? The default object is nothing but Spark. Okay, so this is the default object which is available in our Spark shell, and using a Spark session, right, we can actually build this particular Spark. So how do you what is the syntax for that? This is the syntax: SQL context is equal to spark.sql context. So SQL context is an API, and this Spark is nothing but it is the default object. Okay. Alright, so now let us see its creation. So how do we create it, the ways to create it, which comes first, and what is the one which needs to be created before creating a Spark context, I will tell you. So even before creating a Spark context, right, you are supposed to create its application. Okay, you are supposed to create a Spark config. So basically this Spark config is something like, it is an instance. So in this particular instance, right, we will be giving the application name, like whatever application name you want, you will be specifying that application name. And also not only that, you will also set its master by using the Spark config static methods. Okay, so this is one of the method you have here, right? Set application name, set master, set application name, set master. These are what? These are nothing but Spark config static methods. Okay, so after making use of these particular methods, now what we can do is this Spark config object, right, this particular Spark config object, we can actually pass it. So where are we passing it as an argument? We are passing it as an argument for the Spark context method. Okay, so for the Spark context construct, what are we trying to do? We are trying to pass this Spark context as the argument. Okay, so that while doing that, what are we trying to do? We are trying to create a new Spark context. So even before creating a Spark context, you are supposed to create the Spark config object. So once we create that, only you can actually use this particular Spark context. Alright, so now what else we have? So once you have created this Spark context, right, so you can actually use this particular Spark context in any of your RDDs, and you can actually call those particular different kinds of transformations we have, right, in an RDD. So like parallelize method, text file, different methods we have. So based on the requirement, whichever transformation you want to call, you can actually call that particular transformation. Before calling that transformation in your RDD, you are supposed to create this Spark context. So even before creating Spark context, what are you supposed to create? You will have to create this Spark config. Okay, so first this should be created, next to this, and only after that you can actually call using that particular Spark context. Okay, so this is how you will be creating your Spark context. Coming to Spark session, so how do we create this particular Spark session? So as I have told you, this Spark session is nothing but it is a unified API wherein you can access different kinds of entry points. These 4 different entry points actually you can access. Okay, so basically in few of the environments, right, you don't even have to create this Spark session. By default, the environment itself will create a Spark session for you, so that we can just use that. Okay, so in this particular Spark session, you need to have some syntax, right? So this is the syntax of it. So if you see here, you have a Spark session, you have a builder, master, application name, and then you are using get or create method. So using this get or create method, what are you trying to do? You are trying to create a Spark session. Okay, you are explicitly spending some application name using this get or create method, using this particular instantiation, right? You are trying to instantiate it. So this particular Spark instance, Spark object will be created when you are trying to use this particular syntax. Okay, so not only that, right, we have different kinds of limitations. So that is why we are actually moving from Spark context to Spark session. So what is the major limitation which we have, and why do we prefer Spark session over Spark context? I'll be telling you now. So basically, right, the major limitation I could say is just assume that suppose you have multiple users will be there, right, in any particular project. So assume that you have some few 10 number of users are there. So those 10 users are simultaneously like trying to access the same notebook environment that is having a single Spark context. Okay, so if this is the requirement, when you are trying to use this Spark context, actually the limitation here is there could be only one Spark context per JVM. Okay, that means per one Java virtual machine you can only have one Spark context created. What if you create multiple Spark contexts? So for every user, so if you are having 10 different users, then for 10 different users you are supposed to create those many number of Spark contexts. So when you're trying to do that, what it will do, it will cost you money, it will cost you time also. Okay, so that is one of the major limitation we have here. So as per the requirement, right, we need to have one particular Spark context for every independent user. So this is the main reason why, and also not only that, it will also time taking and money is one of the factor, right? So in our cloud based environment, everything will be on money, right? So time and money are the most important factors which will be affecting when you're trying to deal with this Spark context. Okay, so if you are having 10 number of users, then if they are accessing the same notebook environment that is having a shared context, then as per the requirement, what is supposed to be done, only one particular environment per user needs to be created. That means one Spark context per JVM. Okay, so because of this, it will be taking you lots of time and money. So that is the major limitation we have here. So that is the reason why we are moving to SparkSession. So inside this SparkSession, there is no such limitation. You can actually create multiple SparkSessions on a single JVM. Okay, all right, so these are the major differences between SparkSession and Spark context. Okay, because of the limitations of which we are having for Spark context, right, we are moving to SparkSession, wherein it will be giving you, since it is a unified API, right, you can actually access different kinds of features with less amount of constructs, we can say. Okay, instead of Spark context, Hive context and SQL context, everything is now which is present within a single SparkSession. It's just that very simple. You will be creating this SparkSession and you don't have to worry about creating any separate context. Okay, so this is the major benefit which any particular developer will be getting when they are trying to use this SparkSession. All right, so basically these are the major differences between Spark context and SparkSession. All right, I just hope this session is clear for you. Let me know if you have any doubts in the comment section. All right, so if you have not already subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe.